BBA 104, Indian Ethos and Business Ethics, Unit 12, Ethical Decision Making Process, Utilitarianism. Introduction. There are three conditions that must be present for a situation to be considered an ethical dilemma. First, the first condition occurs in situations when an individual called the agent must make a decision about which course of action is best. Situations that are uncomfortable but that don't require a choice are not ethical dilemma. For example, students in their internships are required to be under the supervision of an appropriately credentialed social work field instructor. Therefore, because there is no choice in the matter, there is no ethical violation or breach of confidentiality when a student discusses a case with a supervisor. The second condition for ethical dilemma is that there must be different courses of action to choose from. Third is, in an ethical dilemma, no matter what the course of action is taken, some ethical principle is compromised. In other words, there is no perfect solution. In determining what constitutes an ethical dilemma, it is necessary to make a distinction between ethics, values, morals, laws, and policies. Ethics are predisposition statements or standards that are used by members of a profession or group to determine what the right course of action in a situation is. Ethics rely on logical and rational criteria to reach a decision, an essentially cognitive process. Values, on the other hand, describe the ideas that we value or prize. To value something means that we hold it dear and feel it has worth to us. As such, there is often a feeling or affective component associated with values. Often, values are ideas that we aspire to achieve, like equality and social justice. Morals describe a behavioral code of conduct to which an individual ascribes. They're used to negotiate, support, and strengthen our relationship with others. Finally, laws and agency policies are often involved in complex cases, and social workers are often legally obligated to take a particular course of action. The Code of Ethics recognizes that legal obligation may require social workers to share confidential information, such as in case of reporting child abuse, but requires that we protect confidentiality to the extent permitted by law. Although our profession ultimately recognizes the rule of law, we are also obligated to work to change unfair and discriminatory laws. There is considerably less recognition of the supremacy agency policy in the code, and ethical standard states that we must not allow agency policies to interfere with our ethical practice of social work. It is also essential that the distinction be made between personal and professional ethics and values. Conflicts between personal and professional values should not be considered ethical dilemmas for a number of reasons. Because values involve feelings and are personal. The rational process used for resolving ethical dilemmas cannot be applied to value conflicts. Further, when an individual elects to become a member of a professional, he or she is agreeing to comply with the standards of the profession, including its code of ethics and values. Recent court cases have supported a profession's right to expect its member to adhere to professionalism, values, and ethics. The Council of Social Work Education states that students who should recognize and manage personal values in a way that allows professional values to guide practice. Therefore, although they can be difficult and uncomfortable, conflicts involving personal values should be considered ethical dilemma. The meaning of ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is a complex situation that often involves an apparent mental conflict between moral imperatives, in which to obey one would result in transgressing another. An ethical dilemma is the one in which a person has to choose between two options, both of which are morally correct but in conflict. Ethics and morals are inseparable. They both deal with questions of right and wrong. What constitutes ethical behavior is determined by societal or cultural norms. What constitutes moral behavior is up to the individual to decide based on his or her own sense of right and wrong. Let's discuss some examples of ethical dilemma. Ethical dilemma, also known as moral dilemma, are situations in which there is a choice to be made between two options, neither of which resolves the situation in an ethically acceptable fashion. In such situations, societal and personal ethical guidelines can provide no satisfactory outcome for the chooser. Ethical dilemmas assume that the chooser will abide by societal norms such as codes of law or religious teachings in order to make the choice ethically impossible. Examples could be your critically ill family member is in the hospital and the doctors and nurses are turning to you to make medical decision on the patient's behalf. You don't know how to decide what to do and could use some guidance. Or you're a patient and are too sick to speak for yourself. You're concerned about who will make medical decisions on your behalf and whether your wishes will be followed. You wonder, what if they disagree about what I want or would be what would be best for me? You are part of the healthcare team and your patient comes from a culture in which it is considered wrong to tell patient that they're dying. You're unclear how to respond to a family's request to conceal the truth from a dying patient. You are a physician, and some may think it is time to withdraw life support and let nature take its course. Yet, the dying patient's family insists that you do everything possible to keep the patient alive. You are unclear how to solve this problem and worry that doing everything might cause patient pain and discomfort without offering any benefit. The examples that we just discussed are situations which are difficult to decide what should be your course of action. And that exactly what constitutes ethical dilemma. There are also different types of ethical dilemma. An absolute or pure ethical dilemma only occurs when two or more ethical standards apply to a situation but are in conflict with each other. For example, a social worker in a rural community with limited mental health care services is consulted on a client with agoraphobia, an anxiety disorder involving a fear of open and public spaces. Although this problem is outside of the clinician's journal competence, the limited options for treatment coupled with the client's discomfort in being too far from home. It would likely mean that the client might not receive any services if the clinician declines on the basis of the lack of competence. Denying to see the patient then would be potentially in conflict with our commitment to promote the well-being of clients. This is a pure ethical dilemma because two ethical standards conflict. It can be resolved by looking at ethical standard which states that the social workers should only accept employment on the basis of existing competence or with the intention to acquire the necessary competence. The social worker can accept the case because discussing the person present limits of her expertise with the client and following through on her obligation to seek training or supervision in this area. However, there are some complicated situations that require decision but may also involve conflicts between values, laws, and policies. Although these are not absolute ethical dilemmas, we can think of them as approximate dilemmas. For example, an approximate dilemma occurs when a social worker is legally obligated to make a report of child or domestic abuse and has concerns about the releasing of information. The social worker may experience tension between the legal requirement to report and the desire to respect confidentiality. However, because of the NSAW Code of Ethics acknowledges our obligation to follow legal requirements and to intervene to protect the vulnerable, technically there is no absolute ethical dilemma present. However, the social worker experiences this as a dilemma of some kind and needs to reach some kind of resolution. Breaking the situation down and identifying the ethics, morals, values, legal issues, and policies involved, as well as distinguishing between personal and professional dimensions, can help with the decision making process and approximate dilemmas. Now, let's talk about ethical decision making. In determining right versus wrong, it has to be remembered that those terms are subjective. That where's that's where understanding the definition of ethics and relying on a corporate code of ethics can be very helpful. The code is the baseline by which a person, group, or organization can measure the facts of a case, including whether a determination can be made impartially. Sorry. It is also important to develop an organization's value statement to reflect your ethical values as well as. This in turn will help the employees to understand your commitment and direction. When analysis and evaluation begins, the right of the individual and group, the equality of treatment, and the steps taken to remedy the issue or situation in a way that best serves the organization's vision or identify must all come into play. By examining each of these elements, a decision that's cohesive, consistent, and appropriate will begin to form. Finally, that decision must be implemented. Otherwise, you are spinning your wheels. Ethical decision making helps the people to make difficult choices when faced with an ethical dilemma, a situation in which there is no clear right or wrong. Now, let's talk about the process of ethical decision making. First step, gather the facts. What this means, don't jump to conclusion without the facts. Questions you can ask is who, what, where, when, how, and why. Finding the facts, however, facts may be difficult to find because of the uncertainty. Uncertainty often found around ethical issues. Some facts are not available. As many facts are available, we should assemble them before proceeding, and all the assumptions should be clarified that you are making. Second, define the ethical issues. Don't jump to solution without first identifying the ethical issues in the situation. Define the ethical basis for the issue that you want to focus on. There can be multiple ethical issues. Focus on one major one at a time. Third, identify the affected parties. Identify all of the stakeholders. Who are the primary or direct stakeholders? Who are the secondary or indirect stakeholders? Why are they stakeholders for this issue? Take the perspective. Try to see things through the eyes of those individuals who are affected. Fourth, identify the consequences. Think about the potential positive and negative consequences for affected parties by decision. Focus on primary stakeholders to simplify analysis until you become comfortable with the process. What is the magnitude of the consequences and probability that the consequences will happen? Will they be short-term consequences or long-term consequences? Will the decision be valid over the broader systemic consequences, which are tied to symbolic and secrecy? Symbolic consequences would be each decision sends a message, and secrecy consequences would be what are the consequences if the decision or action becomes public. Did you consider relative cognitive barriers or biases? Consider what your decision would be on the based only on consequences. Move on and see if it is similar given other considerations. Identify the relevant principle, rights, and justice. Justice issues. Obligation should be thought in terms of principles and rights involved. What obligations are created because of the particular ethical principles you might use in the situation? Examples: do not harm, do unto others as you would them do unto you. Do you want do what you would have done any with anyone in shoes given in the context? What obligations are created because of the specific rights of the stakeholders? What rights are more basic versus secondary in nature? What help protect an individual's basic autonomy? What types of rights are involved, negative or positive? What concepts of justice are relevant, distributive or procedural justice? Did you consider any relevant cognitive barriers or biases? Formulate the appropriate decision or action based solely on the above analysis of these obligations. Consider your character and integrity. Consider what your relevant community members would consider to be kind of the decision that an individual of integrity would make in this situation. What specific virtues are relevant in this situation? Disclosure rules. What would you do if the New York Times reported your action and everyone wants to read it? Think about how your decision will be remembered when you are gone. Did you consider any relevant cognitive barriers or biases? What decision would you come to based solely on character considerations? Think creatively about potential actions. Be sure you have not unnecessarily forced into A corner, you may have some choices or alternatives that have not been considered. If you have come up with a solution A and B, try to brainstorm and come up with a solution C that might satisfy the interests of the primary parties involved in the situation. Eighth, check your gut. Even though the prior steps have argued for a highly rational process, it is always good to check your gut. Intuition is gaining credibility, sorry, as a source of good decision making. Knowing something is not right. Particularly relevant if you have a lot of experience in the area. That would count as expert decision making. Decide on your course of action and prepare responses to those who may oppose your position. Consider potential actions based on consequences. Obligations and character approaches. Do you come up with the similar answers from the different perspectives? Do the obligation and character help you check the consequential preferred action? How can you protect the rights of those involved or your own character while still maximizing the overall good for all the stakeholders? What arguments are most compelling to you to justify the action ethically? How will you respond to these with opposing viewpoints? Always be prepared to deal with the opposing arguments. And that's how you can take a ethical decision when you are stuck in a dilemma. Now, let's come to the next concept, utilitarianism. Sorry. Utilitarianism is a theory of morality that advocates actions that foster happiness or pleasure and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm. When directed toward making social, economic, or political decisions, a utilitarian philosophy would aim for the betterment of society as a whole. Utilitarianism would say that an action is right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of people in a society or a group. It is a theory of morality that advocates actions that foster happiness and oppose actions that causes unhappiness. It promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. When used in a socio-political construct, utilitarian ethics aims for the betterment of the society as a whole. Utilitarianism is a reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, but it has limitations. It does not account for things like feelings, emotions, culture, or justice. It is a tradition of ethical philosophy that is associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, two late 18th and 19th century British philosophers, economists, and political thinkers. Utility, Utilitarianism holds that an action is right if it tends to promote happiness and wrong if it tends to produce sadness or the reverse of happiness. Not just the happiness of the actor, but that of everyone affected by it. At work, one displays utilitarianism when one takes action to ensure that the office is a positive environment for your co-workers to be in, and then make it so for yourself. In business and commerce, utilitarianism holds the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. As such, it is the only moral framework that can justify military force or war. Moreover, utilitarianism is the most common approach to business ethics because of the way that it accounts for costs and benefits. The theory asserts that there are two types of utilitarian ethics practiced in the business world: rule and act. Rule utilitarianism helps the largest number of people using the fairest methods possible, and act utilitarianism makes the most ethical actions possible for the benefit of the people. In the corporate workplace, most companies have a formal or informal code of ethics, which is shaped by their corporate culture, values, and regional laws. Today, having a formalized code of business ethics is more important than ever. For a business to grow, it not only needs to increase its bottom line, but it also must create a reputation for being socially responsible. Companies must endeavor to keep their promises and put ethics at least on par with profits. Consumers are looking for companies that can trust, and employees work better when there is a solid model of ethics in place. On an individual level, if the company makes morally correct decision at work, then everyone's happiness will increase. However, if the company chooses to do something morally wrong, even if legal, the employee's happiness will decrease. The limitations of utilitarianism. In the workplace, though utilitarian ethics are difficult to achieve, these ethics can be challenging to maintain in our business culture, where a capitalistic economy often teaches people to focus on themselves at the expense of others. Similarly, monopolistic competition teaches one business to flourish at the expense of others. A limitation of utilitarianism is that it tends to create a black and white construct of morality. In utilitarian ethics, there are no shades of grey. Either something is wrong or it is right. Utilitarianism can also predict with certainty whether the consequences of our actions will be good or bad. The results of our actions happen in the future. Utilitarianism also has trouble accounting for values like justice and individual rights. For example, say, a hospital has four people whose lives depend upon receiving organ transplant: a heart, lungs, a kidney, and a liver. If a healthy person wanders in the hospital, his organs could be harvested to save four lives at the expense of his one life. This would arguably produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but few would consider it as an acceptable course of action, let alone an ethical one. Let's discuss now the principles of utilitarianism. Pleasure or happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. To say that something has intrinsic value means that it is simply good in itself. Intrinsic value contrasts with instrumental value. Something that has instrumental value when it is a means to some end. Second, actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they promote unhappiness. This principle is quite controversial since it involves the moral quality of an action. It is decided by the size of its consequences. So long as an action produces maximum benefits for the greatest number of people, utilitarianism does not care whether the results are driven by immoral motives. However, this principle can be refuted, and since most people would agree that the moral quality of an action depends on the motive or intention behind it. Third, everyone's happiness counts equally. Although the axiom may seem quite obvious, this principle of equality was radical and progressive in Bentham's time. By then, it was commonly accepted that some lives and some people's happiness was simply more important and valuable than others. Bentham's principle of equality makes the government responsible for creating policies that would benefit all equally and not just the elite. Before ending this unit, there was one more topic that I would like to share with everyone, that is quantitative utilitarianism and qualitative utilitarianism. Quantitative is a branch of utilitarianism that was developed out of the work of Jeremy Bentham. Quantitative utilitarians focus on utility maximization, that is, maximizing the overall happiness of everyone, and use a hedonic approach to determine the rightness or wrongness of actions. Bentham defined as the foundation of his philosophy the principle that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. Qualitative utilitarianism is a branch of utilitarianism that arose from the work of John Stuart Mill. Qualitative utilitarians categorize pleasures and pains in a more qualitative manner, depending on the level of their consequences and disregarding any quantifiable proof of their importance. With this, we come to the end of this unit. Thank you.